educational documentary includes real discussions and depictions of drug use and violent crimes. It is intended for educational purposes only. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Steve does say that he plans to speak at the candlelight vigil on Wednesday. He says he doesn't want the city of Moscow to fall apart over this.
I mean, I understand you guys. You're coming here. I'm just glad.
Can I grab your ID for me?
Yeah, I'm not 21.
Okay.
My roommates are 21. I just came to go to bed.
We're not here to talk about the alcohol stuff, okay?
Okay, yeah.
But this is the second noise complaint we've had here tonight within 2 hours.
I'm sorry.
Okay? So this time it was the blonde gal and the guy on the back porch playing music, okay? So
I sincerely apologize.
Okay.
I'm just going to listen.
Okay. So just so you understand, you could be getting a misdemeanor citation for this. They're all mostly students, so the campus officers can figure out who lives here. And then, honestly, it's a lot worse for them when it comes to court. Pretty frequently. Like, campus will, if students get in trouble, they will, if they get in trouble, the campus, it's actually honestly for, like, minor stuff, campus will handle it. Like, suspend them or kick them out altogether or lose all your financial aid. Like, it's pretty serious, so. They've had several kids like get super hammered, fall off balconies over the years and stuff, and die, so they take it pretty serious. We're not leaving.
Update in the Bryan Kohberger saga, student and employment records were released from the accused quadruple killer's school district where he worked as a security guard up until just 2 years ago. According to the documents, Kohberger's security supervisor at Pleasant Valley School District in Pennsylvania considered him to be reserved, courteous, polite, and even reliable. Kohberger graduated from that same district in 2013. In 2018, he was even credited with helping save the life of a staff member having a medical emergency. As part of the job, Kohberger would report unarmed to the district to work 8-hour security shifts on the weekend, making sure all school buildings were locked and in working order. Records show that he resigned from the position in 2021 after working there for 5 years. Kohberger wrote in his resignation letter that he decided to leave, quote, freely and voluntarily after considering his options. Since Kohberger's arrest, Kohberger's alma mater, DeSales University, released a statement, but his Pennsylvania school district has remained silent. All of their requested records were from a court-ordered subpoena, but it's unclear whether the prosecution or the defense requested them. This all due to a gag order that has been put in place by the judge.
Closed doors to allegations of prosecutorial misconduct and FBI thugs in the wake, a shadow that's lengthened by the unexpected grand jury.
This week, the Moscow Police Department told us there was no threat to the public, but yesterday they walked that back, saying the person who killed these 4 students is still out there and investigators don't know who they are. One thing Police Chief James Fry is insisting is that this was a targeted attack, but they couldn't tell us why they believe that.
We still believe it's a targeted attack, but the reality is there's still a person out there who committed 4 horrible crimes. I will tell you, we're looking at everyone. Every tip we get, every lead we get, there's no one that we're not going to talk to, there's no one we're not going to interview, there's no one that we're not going to look into.
We also learned the killings happened early Sunday morning. Investigators did not find any sign of forced entry into the home or a weapon. Chief Fry says 2 roommates were also home during the attack, but were not hurt. He could not call them witnesses and also couldn't tell us why it took so long for someone to call 911. Chief Fry says investigators are still working out a timeline of what happened. They could tell us 2 of the students had been at a party and the other 2 had been at a bar that night. The Spokane County Medical Examiner confirmed with us they have finished the autopsies of all 4 bodies. They've sent that information over to the Latah County coroner, who will now be able to officially declare manner and cause of death. At the press conference, police say the students were stabbed with a knife. The Moscow Police Department had been getting a lot of criticism for waiting this long to tell us anything. Chief Fry admitted yesterday he should have done a press conference.
So check it out. Determining which fraternities or sororities own off-campus housing can be a bit of a challenge. While some organizations openly declare ownership, others don't. You could potentially find this information through property records or tax documents, but in most cases, this would be a time-consuming process, and additionally, the house is usually owned by a housing corporation or an asset manager associated with the fraternity or sorority. This can make the ownership less obvious, and it may be easier in many cases to ask local residents or someone closer to the university's Greek life, because many times it's not obtainable information, because asset managers or housing corporations are the fronts, serving as owners or leading management for LLC companies that the house is associated or further registered to. What's the point? Is that people could be getting hung up on Perky and other associations. 1122 King, LLC company that's registered as the owner of 1122 King Road, King Place, or King Street residence. And yes, Latah County officially calls it all three names, a street with multiple identities. Queen Road isn't even officially a street. It's a fire exit, often not even being attributed a name in the surveyor's records. Indeed, it's quite intriguing that the police have indicated that the house itself may have been the culprit for making the four victims a target in the first place. As I've mentioned housing and asset management, we shouldn't necessarily be surprised to see a sorority or fraternity house come back with ownerships or managers that are tied to crime and or criminal organizations. So what I wonder is if the house was seized as a part of an asset forfeiture connected to criminal enterprise and asset managers. If that were the case, that means that the federal government could seize 1122 King as a part of an asset forfeiture, deeming it a part of a criminal enterprise or a part of a criminal organization. In doing so, they would be able to infiltrate certain areas, safe houses, or other homes associated with otherwise relevant to the criminal organization or enterprise, and or the agenda thereto, or thereof. In reference to that, I do wonder about a certain grub truck and its potential connection to undercover operations. Let's say, just for shits and giggles, that the state indicates that there might be some non-commercial purpose for such a food truck. Therefore, this food truck wouldn't be subject to taxation. While the specifics of their exact philanthropic activity may not be readily advertised, it could imply that they may be providing a service that benefits the community in a way that, isn't immediately apparent. It wouldn't be the first time such an operation involved food or serving drinks. Serving roles as undercover, the bar scene, and restaurant scene are common tactics infiltrated by police. Often, police stings include cooperation from local businesses, many times a local restaurant, or a local bar. This sting tied to a local bar actually ended up in the murder of the co-owner of a bar, a former FBI agent who was allegedly paying police in the local area to allow him to conduct business after hours and even sell drinks beyond the laws of the local jurisdiction. The most famous public corruption stings of all time, and one of the first of its kind, where federal authorities were allowed to hire people with special privileges, such as attorneys, doctors, members of the clergy. These types of stings take special authorization since they require special privilege informants. Yeah, we're talking about lawyers being able to turn over, roll, or inform on their own clients. To say the least, operations like this can get quite sticky. But if you're wondering about their likelihood in ending in murder, as soon as this undercover began working for the local prosecution in what was considered one of the most corrupt counties in American history, officially anyway, and the prosecutor had declared to this informant and an FBI agent that if he found out the FBI were investigating in his local area, he'd make sure they weren't breathing in his area for very long. In other words, he indicated he would have them off swiftly. Public corruption investigations often become a game of spy versus spy, and they're some of the most dangerous undercover stings and operations that exist. Consider this. While police officers' plights are very apparent in modern culture, something that we don't discuss or hear about often are those that operatives in undercover face. We seldom hear about those plights that often end up in the deaths of heroic types who've endeavored undercover identities in order to take down some of the most dangerous and prolific criminals in American history, those in public office and those who are publicly corrupt. So while we hear often of the dangerous job that police do and the tasks that they fulfill and the dangers that they encounter while fulfilling them, unless the force's tasks are successful, operations won't be made public. If they don't achieve intended outcomes, frankly, from the public relations perspective, the government has no incentive to highlight these instances. Not to mention that if an undercover cop dies while undercover of an identity, they'll publicly be put to rest under a name that doesn't even belong to them. Oftentimes, they've died intending to save the lives of people who will never even know their names, nor will we ever know the task with which they were burdened, a burden for which they've often lost their lives. Yes, undercover operations can get quite sticky. So, for a lot of people, their first question, once they realize that my theory is correct and actually makes more sense out of the Idaho murders than any that they've heard, many instantly fascinated and instantly hit in the face with how the government has often duped them before and will so again. Many questions arise, but one popular question seems to be pretty pervasive, and I want to answer that one here today. Every single solitary time that I go to answer this in writing, I realize that it is just too complicated to explain over a bunch of random comments, so I want to address it here. Clandestine operations that have ended badly and somehow caught the attention of the public can definitely leave one with that duped feeling, the repercussions of which are often to feel like we should question everything we've been told, and often we should. And we've been told lots of lies in this case to legitimize our feelings about that particular thing. And that leads people to question if this entire thing is a psyop type of operation. And my official answer to that is that no, we should not jump straight to that conclusion. And here's why. Because the witness protection program has been functioning for years as a much easier way for the government to protect its interest, its operations, witnesses, and is much easier to pull off than faking the murder of 4 people. So even if all 4 were a part of a clandestine operation that was never supposed to see the light of day, they wouldn't just pretend to kill them off. And if they did, quite frankly, I just can't wrap my mind around a decent motive in order to do so. It'd just be too simple to WITSEC everyone and stow them away and not talk about it again. It's important to note that that's not exactly what's happened here with the witnesses. They've definitely not been put into witness protection. We can garner that from the orders for which Bill Thompson requested from the judge, protection orders which were specified as changeable in the future, and that probably wouldn't happen if these were WITSEC witnesses for which we were discussing. Before I'd ever even let my brain stir to wonder if this was an undercover operation, because I hadn't looked into the crime that much at the time, I thought, wow, that case reeks of privilege as soon as I looked, because I'm thinking, okay, so everyone has an attorney right after their friends are brutally murdered? Not one of them was too poor to afford representation after the fact. Not to mention, not one of the friends depended on the other for their ability to have transportation. I mean, how often is it that none of your friends that are in this extremely youthful phase of life would be carless? Is it just me? Am I just that poor? No, wait, it's not just me. It was lots of my friends. Plenty of them didn't have rides. Cars are expensive. It's 2023. So yeah, I'm like, oh, okay, they're all a bunch of rich kids, sorority and fraternity members. But now that I do realize a part of this has to do with undercover operations, it makes a lot more sense that everybody walked away with representation. They would have union reps and be able to easily be appointed or afforded the ability, opportunity, and privilege to be represented during such a time, especially during such a time that their coworkers, colleagues, and or people investigating them themselves had wound up in a tragic accident, and or quadruple murder, to boot in the same home with other agents or operatives. But to skip back to what brought me to this point, even the CIA, known for its covert operations, doesn't usually undertake extreme measures such as to fake a death. Is it something that's been done? Yes. Is it something that the government would plan in advance without a really legitimate need to do so? I highly doubt it, just because of the pure logistical nightmare that such operations turn out to be. So no, I do not think that the deaths are fake, and I wish that I could say that was a thing, but it's typically not something I'm able to conjecture here. And that includes the Bryan Kohberger death as well. And I feel like that this is a very unhealthy thing that people conjecture about all the time, because, I often see people wanting to think that, oh, well, maybe they're all alive somewhere, waiting to testify, or maybe it was all made up to catch public corruption. And I just don't find that to be the case. And it's an unhealthy attitude, to just simply accept that the government would fake the death of a human being, much less four, and it would raise serious implications, especially for a domestic agency to be allowed to do that to its citizens. There are specific laws preventing this from happening. Does it mean that it never happens? No. Enters MK Ultra and all that, okay? So the government has definitely broken the laws about what it is supposed to do domestically to surveil and otherwise do clandestine, psychological, and covert operations on its own citizens. It's typically a big no-no, okay? So we shouldn't just accept it and be like, oh, well, we hope that they're all alive and a part of something that is highly illegal, highly unethical, and something that we just simply should not wrap our heads around for any willy-nilly purpose, okay? It's much more likely that, typical to the job, the dangers introduced, unfortunately, reared their ugly head in a case of clandestine undercover sting operations that either involve the police, public corruption, or corruption within the universities and the fraternities and sororities, or all of the above. And I know that's hard to wrap your mind around. Enters the North Carolina case, where all went well, no students died, and they were able to come out and tell us a small hint of the covert operations that they utilized in order to uncover a transnational organized crime group working out of the universities in North Carolina, where 3 prominent colleges were busted with the use of undercovers and informants, infiltrating the sororities and fraternities for which were distributing drugs in their local relevant areas. In the early 2000s was around the first time that DEA or FBI introduced to the public that they had conducted such a sting. This was in the state of California, and people were pretty fucking miffed about it, saying that they had created crime, brought all of their big bucks to the university, and created the opportunity for people who may not have otherwise committed crimes to commit them. The same thing that FBI operations and ATF operations often do whenever they set up fencing corporations or fencing businesses or firearms businesses. While I was living in the Midwest, there was a famous and epically unethical operation ran by the local ATF agency in my city, and they were selling and buying firearms. In this endeavor, they actually gave the instructions to a few litigants who wound up fighting cases from the opportunity to steal guns and actually offload them for cash money to federal agents themselves. And this is what a lot of people don't like about these operations, okay? But as the Department of Justice reported from its investigation into the FBI's use of informants and undercover operations have long been considered an evil but necessary part of surveillance and counter-surveillance efforts among law enforcement members in the United States. I don't necessarily agree with that as far as it contributes to the regular citizens of the United States. However, I'm willing to concede with public corruption that would typically be the only way to go about disrupting something with those proportions and with the ability to affect harm on such a large scale. So let's talk about some of the power of deduction that we can use to note if there is an undercover operation with a particular case. Some notables might be the protection of identities that wouldn't otherwise be protected in a public case. That's typically adults who are going to be witnesses in a case. For people who think that that's normal during pretrial phases of court, it's not. Look right above Bryan Kohberger. There's a multiple murder case in the pretrial phases, and almost everything's unredacted, unsealed. We can see all of the summons to court. We can see all of the returns of those summons, clads of evidence, and a lot more integrity than this one. You'll also see a lot of stipulations that preserve the integrity of ongoing investigations and protection of police techniques. In such cases, it's also possible that special prosecuting attorneys will be appointed to the prosecution's team, as well as oftentimes the criminal, if involved in the clandestine operations themselves, will also have specialized attorneys. Now, as I wondered in my last episode, I've always wondered why Ann Taylor, in a notable use of an outside contract with another county, Latah County, without really telling us why, forgoes the opportunity to assign Bryan Kohberger the normal public defender from their county. And they write a rather expensive contract coordinated with Kootenai County to hire Ann Taylor, an attorney who is from one of 2 counties designated as high drug trafficking areas impacted by domestic and transnational organized crime groups. This means that Ann and attorneys from the Boise, Ada counties, public defender's office, and obviously be more skilled and experienced at litigating cases that have such complications littered in them as informants, operatives, and undercovers. The extreme limited information disclosure in this case is the number one teller that it is heavily involved in undercover operations. And while a lot of people are going to say that, I'm a crazy conspiracy theorist, I'm going to say you're fucking naive if you think that the case isn't an undercover operation and that this level of involvement and specialized counsel, on top of the case handling, the limited information, and the high security measures that have been sought here, are normal, or merely simply because it's a quadruple murder. Well, I question your ability to deduce facts from cases. So you can question my sanity all you would like. And for the rest of you, let's kick this thing off. The lack of public statements. Law enforcement agencies often provide public statements and many press releases about significant cases, but here we have seen a communication deadlock. And while seemingly being an open and shut case, where after 6 weeks of begging the public to come forward with anything they know, as well as telling the public it was going to take them quite some time to solve this complex quadruple murder, turns out there was a knife sheath under one of the victims which had DNA the whole time. Wait, what? That's not complicated. That's an open and shut, provable by DNA evidence case. Sure. So why the hell are they so busy telling us how fucking complicated something is open and shut as we rolled over the body and found our link to the killer? Well, isn't that complicated? Send in all your experts. And there's someone who keeps getting brought up in the hearing where Goncalves' attorney is fighting for their gag order, their non-dissemination order against the victims of the families here, who were specifically named in this order to no longer speak with any member of the media about any fact that hadn't been released in the case. It's important to note that Megan Marshall, the magistrate judge assigned to the case at the time, noted to Goncalves' attorneys that even if they could state anything that they had wanted, that it also had to be the truth. And many times it is brought up that the family's statements are going on the record and they're able to alter and change the court case as a whole, meaning they are concerned that defense attorneys and others would utilize the mistakes and the holes poked into the official narrative that they had given the media as reason to question the integrity of the investigation as a whole. And they're correct about that because many times some of those mistakes here and there have been a direct rip in the narrative. And in fact, I think that was probably their intent often, such as the University of Idaho writing off the targeted attack as a blame game for the house. We think the house was targeted. And after that, we hear that it was corrected via the family reporting that Kaylee was not even supposed to be inside of the home. We have this on top of the fact that later on Ethan's residence was updated to not be the 1122 King Road home, but that he was actually a visiting guest of the home. Now, I believe that this could have been changed in order to avoid accountability for the sororities and fraternities who were not technically supposed to be allowing. Technically, according to the University of Idaho, first-year freshmen are supposed to live inside the campus housing, and if they have a lot of overflow and they're forced to place first-year students somewhere else, they have to go through the motions of planning out what exactly they're going to do with that overflow, and there's a lot more accountability involved in the first-year freshman fraternity and sorority members, such as Ethan Chapin. So I believe he was technically not supposed to be a guest in the home, but he certainly was not supposed to be living there with the girls. But I do believe that he actually, in fact, was. Why? Because no one ever mentions being Ethan's roommate. Even the dude at the Sigma Chi house didn't say, yeah, Ethan lives here where I live. He said Ethan was at the house all the time, and I knew Xana before Ethan ever came along. Just kind of a strange statement that I won't get into the full details of for the purposes of this episode. However, you get my drift. No one ever mentions being the actual roommate, bunkmate, or housemate of Ethan Chapin. He seems to be the housemate of our other 3 murdered victims and the 2 quote-unquote surviving roommates. Where did he live? But long story short, I think the Goncalves were able to remove that power from the University of Idaho, stating it was merely the house, with one simple statement: Kaylee was already moving out of the home. So why the hell did it happen here, then, and now? And why would the Chapins' official statement be to ask police to please disclose what they know and tell the truth? I mean, how many victims' families do you hear publicly asking the police to come out with what they know and tell the truth? And that's exactly why Steve Goncalves was in the media, losing his mind, telling people there's no way that you can ask the public with zero context to come forward with anything. Because people with no context have no context to come forward with absolutely anything that's valid. I mean, there could be literal friends of undercover operatives who obviously didn't know that these quote-unquote friends were undercover operatives. But even without that context, there may be plenty of clues that that person without the context would have zero clue was suspicious at all. Uncle Bob was actually at the Corner Club, and after the surveillance video was released, I saw Uncle Bob at the Corner Club. And I also saw Uncle Bob had red liquid on his pants that night. But he told me he spilt his tequila sunrise on his jeans at a club at the opposite end of town. How the hell was I supposed to know it had anything to do with the Idaho murders? Boom. That's why the public needs context. They can't help you unless you help them help you. And I think this is another answer to all of the leaked footage and evidence. Do you guys remember one of the cops that night that they had returned to the home after a daytime visit there earlier that day? And one of the officers disclosed to the young men who had answered the 1122 King door that his son had recently started at the University of Idaho. Well, you may not know this, but there are many operations that could benefit from legacy operatives, undercovers who operate from families who have been in law enforcement and military operations for generations. Legacy. Some say they were born for the job. I believe that in many cases, that is exactly what we have going on here. That's exactly why the gag order was considered not to be unconstitutional, because otherwise I see no reason why Goncalves' attorney, who is a privately hired individual who has no reason not to charge his clients more for an appellate motion, which would immediately remove that gag order. But I think whenever Steve seems to communicate that he was told to shut the F up or what could happen, and he comes back only speaking through his attorney, we could deduce that what might have happened is, well, what would happen if your child ended up dead in a clandestine operation and you wanted some accountability. And that's that people are getting pissed off about some of the things that you've mentioned and are telling you to shut the fuck up, or you could lose your liberty just like Kohberger did. You could come up on some brand new charges yourself and go sit your ass in jail for being a traitor to your country. Or you can do what we've told you to do and shut the fuck up. Not only do we see parents who are heavily involved in the universities possibly, but we see parents with criminal charges which are somewhat obscure. And in many cases, I'm not even sure are actual cases, but possibly undercover identity. This is a part of a technique that the federales use in order to make someone look more thug than they are. And it can honestly be a dead giveaway sometimes for legal analysts who are able to deduce certain discrepancies or oddities that typically don't happen in your everyday spirit of law or experience of law, such as the amount of probation violations and violent crimes that somehow magically Demetrius and Emma are allowed to get away with, up till and including murder charges that they were set free following. Yeah, crazy, right? Almost like the story of this girl, also hanging out with Xana and the Idaho victims. She's a uniformed officer who's obviously done some undercover work. This doesn't make her an operative. She is a uniformed officer who sometimes completes undercover work. Obviously dangerous in its own way due to their public appearances in uniform. But oftentimes you'll see holes in their arrest story, such as when she was featured in an article featuring the county's hottest mugshots. That's right. Oh, how awkward. And even in that article, they noted that the record didn't officially state why she had been pulled over in the first place, but that she punched a cop. And I'm telling you, I know thug motherfuckers, and I don't know not a single one who punched a rando cop who pulled them over. So yeah, this little cutie's a thug. Oh wait, nope. She's a cop. Another thing that I was thinking about when I first started looking into Moscow, I was so annoyed every time that I had to type in their names and remember how they were spelled. And I thought it was so odd that every single one of them, all 6 of the roommates, or all 6 of the individuals, 2 survivors, allegedly not a roommate, Ethan, and the 3 victims, Xana, Kaylee, and Maddie, all have very odd names. They not only have odd names, but I mean, literally, they have rare names that are hardly documented, such as the case with Mogen being so unique, in fact, that it doesn't technically have an origin according to many sources. Along with Kernodle, which is a very rare name to have in the United States specifically, and most of which came from just a couple of states. Some of them being the Carolinas. Remember that whole federal operation, colleges, and something about the cartel, transnational organized undercover operation going on at elite colleges on the East Coast? What was it? Yeah. Kaylee, who was allegedly going to school and getting her degree to become a teacher, was also allegedly going to move to Texas in the middle of her senior year. Quite a complicated year to transfer during, right? Not to mention that she had a sibling allegedly graduating the same year. So without being twins who had absolutely never delayed a class or a semester, this seems pretty fucking rare to have a sibling walking the same stage with you at graduation. Not to mention that her parents said that she got a tech job in Texas. So she had recently been hired for something that was totally different from what she was getting an education for, and different from allegedly the career goals she had set out after, which is not necessarily uncommon, of course. However, when we look at Occam's razor, and a lot of people like to think that, oh, Occam's razor says this can't be possible. Actually, due to the facts that are available to us, this is the most plausible Occam's razor theory, because contrary to popular belief, the point is that most of the time, the simplest explanation given the data set of facts in any given situation will typically logically be the best place to start. So, the simplest explanation with the facts that are available. And of course, the more facts that are available, the more specific and therefore complicated said simple solution that would match could be. So the more complicated the situation, the more complicated the simple answer would be. I'm sure there's a better way to say that, but I can't think of it right now. Now we're going to talk about some of the facts that make Bryan Kohberger an illogical enigma, as the mainstream narrative would tell it. The mainstream would tell us that his apartment was fairly empty. This is something that often happens with undercovers and their pretend residents. A former informant for the Quad Cities Task Force was also a teaching assistant at WSU. Something that I wonder is this specific and strategic to the particular operation or organization being targeted. Because the kid is getting a doctorate, okay? He's completing his PhD courses. He has a fucking master's degree. And not only did he complete his master's degree, but then he goes on to go further. He's going to be a doctor of his field. Dr. Kohberger. Okay? And this is from someone who allegedly has this criminal past, who allegedly has this heroin addiction. And they chose heroin too, okay? Heroin. Heroin is the drug that has the least functioning addicts. There are probably more functioning crackheads than there are functioning heroin addicts. All right, so you don't find a whole lot of heroin addicts active on the university, or at least not for very long. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying it happens in much less volume than, say, functioning cocaine addicts or etc. Dropping some Molly on the weekends. So on top of all of these addiction issues, past charges, allegations that he's been fired due to allegations against him, and all of these red flags that would typically keep him out of the industry, for which he is continuously pursuing up until the point of becoming a straight up motherfucking doctor in the industry. An industry that's going to be increasingly difficult for a heroin addict with this big of a rap sheet on his resume, somehow super easily for the news to find out, so any background check would come across. Yeah, okay, sure, that's a pretty exciting story, and next, Lies on Ice. As it pertains to siblings, Xana has a sibling that was completing school and courses at WSU. Practically looks like Xana's twin. Then she's dating Ethan, who is a triplet. Skagit County, Washington, on the border of Canada, the United States, is dating the border of Mexico and the United States. And in another sibling twist, Bryan Kohberger's sister allegedly worked as a counselor for the school. His mother worked as a paralegal for the school, and his dad is allegedly a maintenance worker who, guess what, could also be for the school. And I think that that is actually exactly what they were doing together on the ride back home. Everyone's been wondering what I was conjecturing. I'm conjecturing that they were both living in the area because they were both assigned to the area at that time for a particular thing. That's why the apartment didn't have that much shit in it. That's why dad allegedly, according to the public, got a ticket and a completely illogical plan to drive back with his son across the country instead of buying his son a plane ticket. Not saying you can't enjoy road trips with your kids or whatever, okay? But I am saying that a maintenance worker could be a pretty good in to the dirty antics that are going on behind the scenes and on every level, literally, of universities that border each other on the state line. Not only that, but are from counties which could easily be more exploitable due to not exactly being HIPAA areas, which would have a lot more funding in order to disrupt crime in the area. However, these local universities do each have branches located in all of the most prominent drug trafficking areas for those two states. Another thing they have in common is a problem with the Sigma Chi chapters. All the way up until Sigma Chi and WSU's campus getting a dry house, no longer being allowed to offer alcohol on their premises, even to students over 21. Pennsylvania locations. They're currently suspended for ignoring COVID regulations at Penn State, and there's been multiple instances of suspicions surrounding many of the Pennsylvania universities, including a rash of student suicides around the same time that U of I and WSU were experiencing falling deaths, which are often attributed to fraternities and sororities across the country, but were attributed thereto en masse and a plethora of cases in Idaho and Washington. Not to mention, as it turns out, a Pennsylvania organized crime group, much like the one in Arizona, which it has links to, according to the DEA and the FBI, are the culprit of drug trafficking up the I-5 and I-15 corridors, then hitting east and west after they get to Washington, going into Idaho, and connecting to Canadian and Alaskan groups, completing the transnational trip from Arizona to the east and the west coast, and of course to our relevant area. The idea that 8 students in this rando murder would be connected to high drug trafficking areas in each and every case, you're telling me not one of them, and I mean not a single one of them, come from a non-highly impacted area, which would be highly infested with federal agents who work those areas in order to disrupt crime and drug trafficking. Not one of them is from one of those areas, and I'm telling you, it's the minority. There's a whole lot of United States to be born in, and these individuals in all 8 cases were born in HIPAA areas, and in many cases were born in HIPAA areas and then moved to another HIPAA area, i.e. mommy or daddy got a new job in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, or Post Falls, Idaho.